Good morning, Pennsylvania. Boy, it's really my great pleasure to speak with you this morning, and I'm thankful to the Building 1 Pennsylvania organizers for having me and my family down from our home in Brooklyn. We got to see what late-night construction crews on the roads in Pennsylvania look like. Far more efficient than we do it at rush hour in New York City, let me tell you. I'm going to read my remarks today so that I don't fall through this trap door when my 20 minutes is done. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm an urbanist law professor, originally from Harlem. And that means that I teach about the structure of municipalities and neighborhoods and how they either facilitate or thwart our ideals through typical patterns of residential organization. Today represents a special privilege because I feel like I'm speaking to my subject. You all either are or are closely connected to local government. And when we look at the sheer numbers of people employed in local government, the tasks that you do, the responsibilities that you have, you quickly realize that more than the federal government, more than the state government, local government is government. So nothing really affects our lives like local government does. And local government today, as the good mayor just indicated in his remarks, especially among older cities and first-tier suburbs, faces stifling fiscal stress, entrenched racial and economic segregation, and serious economic instability for reasons that predate the recession, and unless we see transformative change, will continue well after this recession has ended. So on that upbeat note, let me talk in gross general terms about how we got here, the origins of suburbs in general, in particular, how their strengths often mask their inherent weaknesses, and the assumptions that lay unexamined at the heart of a suburban mythology that has made real reform difficult. And before I continue, I do want to acknowledge that not everything I describe applies equally to all parts of the country or even to all parts of a particular region, that there are huge differences, huge disparities in different parts of the country, even different parts of this state, and as we've heard already, different parts of this region. So places are complex and different, but several trends hold. And so I'll start by throwing out three basic assumptions ingrained in our ideals about really what amounts to middle-class life. The first is that being middle class represents self-sufficiency. According to this belief, neither help nor handouts produced the American dream, but rather grit and merit did. The second assumption is that preserving middle-class benefits requires maintaining distance from the poor. Whether it is home values, crime, educational performance, or drug culture, nearby poverty threatens the maintenance of a middle-class life, according to this idea. And the third assumption is that segregation no longer exists unless it's voluntary. According to this belief, America may be proud of its triumph over Jim Crow, and whatever separation remains merely reflects people's social preferences. This reasoning explicitly offers the language of colorblindness. Now, in my view, all of these assumptions are flawed, but let me come back to that later. Because there's aspiration in these assumptions which reflects some of our better ideas. And so I ask you to keep the three assumptions in mind as we go briefly back to the origin of suburbs in the United States. So in the beginning, suburbs were a hard sell, associated either with the very poor, the very inefficient, or the very rich. The sheer costs of land development beyond the city limits and the problem of transportation did not make suburbs a plausible alternative for many folks until automobiles became more accessible after World War I. Still, suburbs didn't become an attractive alternative to city life for large numbers of people until they became affordable to a substantial middle class. This didn't happen until World War II and the housing crunch that followed. And beyond the demographic demand, however, was federal support for new mortgage instruments, namely low down payments and amortization, as well as the subsidization of highways that made commuting possible. These New Deal and post-New Deal developments in the creation of a suburban middle class are very well known to most of you in the room. Many of your families lived this history. Your parents moved from cities to suburbs, not just because it was bucolic and safer for children and free of urban hazards and clean, but often because it was, in many cases, cheaper. And it was the best investment most households ever made, as property values increased exponentially over the next few decades, making that single-family detached home in a stable little burb the single greatest engine of wealth creation ever invented, if you could get one. And that's really the point. A relatively silent minority of blacks, Puerto Ricans, and certain immigrant groups were redlined, trapped in cities, and could not get such mortgages or benefit from such massive government subsidization, which reveals two very important ideas at the base of suburban life: local control and exclusion. Local control follows the idea of local sovereignty. That's evident in home rule grants. It's realized in the extension to municipalities of police powers to control the character of one's community. At its best, local control creates the conditions for democracy. It allows people a say in the decisions that affect their home environments. It is the aspirational embodiment of citizen participation. However, the other idea that constitutes the foundation of suburban life, the defensive posture so much at the heart of police powers, is exclusion. Exclusion of incompatible uses like factories and undesirable people like blacks and immigrants has turned mainly on the zoning power over land use, one of the enumerated police powers local governments have. Municipalities got a lot of help from the federal government, as well as private actors in the real estate industry, as they defined who should be excluded and how. Even the most stark racial prejudice of the Jim Crow era could be justified on economic grounds. Blacks, like cement plants, were simply bad for property values. So what is important to note at this juncture is not simply that local control and exclusion went hand in hand. They did, and they do. We call it fiscal zoning. But more importantly, it's critical to see how they inform markets, even in the absence of overt racial references. They define what has value and what does not. They tell people where to invest and where to avoid. And they do so in a competitive market for tax capacity that makes bucking the trend irrational. It makes racial integration, for instance, look like fiscal suicide. So to continue with the history for another moment, suburbanization gets another huge jolt after 1954, when the Supreme Court outlaws racial segregation in public facilities with Brown versus Board of Education. Yes, we also have deindustrialization and the move to a service-based economy, but we have in Brown a built-in reason to recreate restricted zones of opportunity beyond city lines, to resegregate under the banner of local control, to exclude through zoning and covenants and social pressure in order to protect an area's assets, and to protect the jurisdictional sanctity of these pristine areas with municipal incorporation and resistance to annexation. And as a result, most social histories of the suburbs begin with what the census was able to capture beginning in 1970, when waves of white homeowners disappear from cities. Less well known, though, is the support that the Supreme Court gave to the new middle-class residents. During that decade, the court handed down ruling after ruling that validated the three assumptions I talked about earlier, and did so in the language of local control and rational exclusion. In Milliken v. Bradley, the court upheld the right of Detroit's suburbanites to ignore the effects of school segregation policies that no longer benefited them once they'd left the city.